Kia ora everyone, this is Anderson's Odyssey. I'm Jacob Anderson and my guest today is Dr. Richard Newcomb. Richard is the Chief Scientist at Plant and Food. Richard, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Kia ora, and thanks for inviting me.
Richard, I think first off, I think it'd be good to maybe let everybody know what exactly Plant and Food does and what your role is at Plant and Food.
Sure. So Plant and Food Research is a Crown Research Institute, one of a number of similar entities that is a provider of research to a number of sectors within New Zealand. We specifically look after a lot of the plant production sectors, so everything from horticulture, kiwi fruit and apples, through arable, through to seafood as well. So we also have a group that looks at developing new aquaculture and fish harvesting technologies. My role within the organisation is Chief Scientist, so I kind of set science strategy, especially for the more fundamental research within the organisation, and also just do a lot of work around sort of science quality assurance, so making sure that we're up with the play on all the kind of internationally best and most relevant science for the work that we do.
And I think it's probably something that everyone's conscious of, but not had a lot of thought or doesn't really know what direction the world is heading in. But as we have this growing production, there's this increased demand on food, how we produce food, both from a nutritional standpoint, but also from a sustainability standpoint. What are some of the trends, or what are some of the big areas that you think are occurring in food production generally?
Yeah, so that's right. So there's big demand increases. So the population of the planet is still increasing. It's going to reach about 10 billion people within about 30 years, and probably top out around there. So demand's increasing, and also the types of consumers changing too. More and more people are living in cities, getting more disconnected from where their food comes from. But also, I think more recently, starting to appreciate that healthy food's probably a good idea, but also not just healthy for themselves, but healthy from the planet. We've seen the issue of sustainability move now to being what we call a consumer trait. So it's not just in the minds of the growers of food, but it's now central in the minds of the consumers of food. So when they're going out there purchasing, they're thinking more not just about whether it's going to taste good or be good for them, but they're thinking about things like, is it produced sustainably? How much fertilizer went into producing this, and how much carbon was burnt in producing this food? And how much plastic am I going to have to throw away when I get home? And so that's become a really important point for consumers. So that's probably one of the major trends that we're now seeing that's changing what we do in terms of the research. So that's influenced our research to move more to addressing those sustainability issues more so than ever before.
And I think one of the big questions or confusions around sustainability and around the food that we eat is the input and also the genetics. So perhaps how can we know that, I guess, some people say, what does organic mean, or what does, pesticide-free mean? How do we kind of really clarify to people or help them understand what good practice is on a farm or in a vineyard or where they're growing the products?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It is currently it's quite difficult for the consumer to find out that information that they really want. I mean, there are brands like Organics that provide some level of assurance around some of the inputs, but increasingly, even within conventional production, that consumers are demanding things like spray diaries. So how often and when was the food sprayed before I've now consumed it? So we're seeing information like that. But I think that's a big opportunity for research to look at developing whole models of the production system that allow us to minimize the amount of inputs while still looking at finding producing the required level of productivity, and then having some measures or that we can, or some markers, if you like, of sustainability that give the consumer some level of assurance that the food's been produced sustainably. And I think there's quite a bit of work to come in that area yet.
Well, I mean, what humans have been doing for thousands of years is selectively breeding plants and animals to optimize different traits and different genetic varieties to benefit whatever it is that they're targeting. We're now starting to see all sorts of unusual things like red kiwi fruit, for example. How do we do that naturally, and are we speeding up that process, or is that still a sort of a selective breeding that has happened naturally over thousands of years, or what's the kind of the difference now?
So so just going backwards a little bit. So yeah, we've just talked about different ways that we can increase productivity by inputs like nitrogen and fertilizer, and how we want to minimize them. So we normally look at this as sort of an equation where there's multiple different ways that you can look at productivity. First is you can influence the genetics. And then the other thing you can change the management regime, so put fertilizers on. And of course there's the environment too. We can't do much about that, although we are seeing climate change, so we can do something about that. But certainly so those are kind of the three factors, and we call that the G by E by M equation for productivity. So obviously genetics is a really important part of that, and it has been something that humans have been looking at and manipulating the genetics of their food crops for thousands of years. And it's no different today. We're still doing that. We are still looking at improving, taste and health and productivity and sustainability traits within these plants. And the way that we do that, there's obviously technologies come along now, and there's many different ways in which we can speed up that breeding process. Speed is probably one of the most important factors, especially for some of the long-lived plants, perennial plants. So any ways that we can speed up that breeding process, the better. And also ways in which we can predict what the plants are going to look like, and the sort of the traits they're going to have, the quality factors they're going to have using genetics. So one of the main advances is that we can use genetic markers to actually predict which plants are going to have the traits and the qualities that we want. So there are technologies known as marker-assisted selection and genomic selection, where we do that, where we pick these on a whole genome sort of wide scale. And with whole genome sequencing now, I mean, all of our crops have their genome sequenced, and we can look at variants or differences across the whole genome now, and we're selecting different individuals from a cross, where we may have taken one plant, two plants across them, and to create a whole family from that of plants. And so we can use genetics to pick out the ones that we predict will have the best apples or what. So that's become an important technology, really spread up the breeding process. Of course, the other kinds of technologies that have come along are genetic modification, where we insert genes from the same or another plant, and also more recently gene editing technology, where we can change individual letters within the genome of a plant. So yes, technologies are rapidly changing, and becoming available for breeders. So currently, I mean, we predominantly within plant and food research use, within our breeding programs, we either use classical breeding, or we use marker-assisted breeding or genomic selection. So we're not actually using the new GM or gene editing technologies in our conventional breeding programs, current breeding programs. But how we do use those new technologies is we use them to understand if we were able to breed a plant that had a characteristic that we wanted, could we predict what that would look like by making some change at the genetic level? So we use it, if you like, to make predictions about whether we should breed for a particular trait or not. So, so it's kind of like a technology that we use to see if the things that we would breed for naturally would actually work out the way that we'd like them to.
So do you do that in the lab, or do you have to model that, or do you have to do that overseas because that's not possible in New Zealand yet? Or what's the sort of the process, I guess, to try and use those technologies to then predict what would happen in nature?
So currently, gene editing is under our legislation in New Zealand as a form of genetic modification. It's not in other jurisdictions necessarily around the world, but in New Zealand it is. And we have to do that in a lab situation, or at least a contained glasshouse facility. So all of that work is done in what we call containment within labs and similar facilities. So no, we can't grow it in the ground outside in New Zealand, but it still gives us enough information about what these different genes do and what a plant might look like with these different traits for us to take that information and then apply it to our conventional breeding programs.
Right, yeah, so I didn't realise that there was greenhouses, or there was genetically modified plants and experiments of that nature happening in New Zealand. I thought that had to be done overseas, but obviously it can't be out in the open and have the potential to be contaminate other areas and things. What, in terms of, and I think there's still a lot of concern about these products or these plants in terms of safety. Because I guess there's two parts of the genetic technologies. One is where the parts of the DNA are removed or inserted or just reworked, and then there's another genetically modified organism which you take a piece of genetic material and then you're also adding material from another organism, and they're two quite different technologies. Perhaps do you want to break those two down and then talk a little bit about how some of these products are, for the most part, safe or don't have sort of health risk? I mean, there's other unforeseen risks, I suppose, when there are in nature, but perhaps that would be something to kind of go into.
Sure. So under the kind of original sort of genetic modification technology, genes typically move from one species to another. So this is known as transgene technology, where you're moving the gene from one species into the other. Often, I mean, it's not just the safety, but I think it's more, philosophical and issues, and these kind of technologies run against some sort of core values that people hold around whether we should be manipulating organisms and the genetic component of organisms. I mean, I know that, for instance, Maori, for instance, aren't very happy. It strikes against some of their values when you are mixing whakapapa by taking DNA from one organism and putting it into another. So I think a lot of the health issues around and safety issues around these technologies are probably those arguments have expired just because people have been eating transgenic GM material in other countries for many, many years now, for over 20 or 30 years. So I think safety is not an issue. Environmental compatibility is probably an issue, and I think some of the value questions are another issue. Some of the new kinds of genetic modification, if you like, these new gene editing technologies that don't necessarily employ a transgene, or they make very small changes to the DNA, are probably much more acceptable because they don't necessarily run across those values that people hold around about moving DNA from one species to another. They also, that the gene editing technology often produces changes that we all naturally see anyway. So in natural species, there are lots of point mutations along within a genome, so single changes in the letters of the DNA. And that's what this gene editing technology can do. It can create very similar changes. In fact, they're indistinguishable often from the changes that we see in nature. So some of the arguments are that, well, there should be little safety concerns if all that's being done is to create variants that we already see in nature. And if we're not adding DNA from another species, we're not sort of violating some of those core values. So gene editing's probably got a lower threshold in terms of public acceptance, but I think there's still quite a bit of social license work to do to understand whether what people think about these new technologies. Of course, they're coming so fast that I think they're almost coming too fast for people to understand what they are and have a good think about what they think about them, and then for that to be taken into account when we're looking at deploying these technologies.
Yeah, I've talked to a few people and they've emphasized the concern that it's not the technology itself, but the possibility that, you know, one company could get their hands on, say, a broccoli that requires far less fertilizers, and it grows bigger, and it, you know, you get these much better outputs. What is that? I guess one of the other concerns. Do you think that, you know, one super company could kind of come on board and, you know, you monopolize all of the crops, or is that something as well you think that might be one of these big concerns?
I mean, I think it's a concern, but I don't think it's necessarily connected to the technology, that concern. I mean, that concern is there with any kind of, a seed company having rights to a seed, whether it's genetically modified or not. So I think they're kind of independent concerns. So I don't see them necessarily as being connected. But I mean, being a government organisation as we are, I mean, some of our core values are around doing what's best for New Zealand and the people of New Zealand. So we're not going to enter into sort of arrangements like that where they're not beneficial to us as a country, because our remit is around doing the best for New Zealand and New Zealanders rather than for planted food research. While we are a limited liability company, you know, we are also owned by the government, and so we have quite a different remit. So
if a company does say come up with this strand of crop or whatever it happens to be, do they own the IP of those seeds, or if someone else can get their hands on those seeds, are they allowed to sell them, or what's the sort of arrangement there in terms of IP regarding some of these products?
It varies quite a lot. So sometimes some of these seeds or would be, if it produces a crop that's deemed to have novel characteristics, the inventors could seek protection under the Plant Varieties Rights Acts within their country, and they could and then they could license those rights out to various growers in what might be a commercial arrangement. So that's one kind of commercial model. They also, the inventors also might decide to publicly release the material as well. So you could have versions in between those two, from a very strict kind of commercial model where you have a very limited release right through to an open public domain release. So we as an organisation do all sorts of have all sorts of different commercial arrangements, but at the core of those arrangements are doing the best thing for New Zealand to optimise the economic, social, environmental well-being of New Zealand and the New Zealanders. So yeah, we do operate commercially as well, and because sometimes commercial models are the best way to ensure that New Zealand and New Zealanders benefit maximally from these discoveries. So yes, there's a whole variety of options there.
Do you think? What do you think the best thing going forward is to try and have that national discussion or have that conversation to understand what values we do want in New Zealand, and how we fit in terms of our products that we consume here, but also how we kind of market our brand overseas, because I know that that's one of the main concerns is around the New Zealand brand, I guess, and not having these genetically modified organisms or these other kind of technologies on our soil.
Yeah, that's right. So there's an argument at the moment that that we are gaining some advantage or benefits from the fact that we are currently GE free, and that this is creating some sort of value add to New Zealand. I think the best way forward here is to open up the dialogue. It always is conversation, and again, I think Māori can lead the way here with Hui. They understand how conversation can reach consensus. It would be a long conversation, and people have got to respect each other's rights to hold certain views. But certainly it's going to be very interesting to see how New Zealand in the long term can maintain its advantage and its ability to produce premium products and sell them overseas without using some of these technologies. And and also the other thing that's coming at us, of course, is things like climate change. And that's the scale of change with our climate is happening so rapidly, and whether we're going to have to consider using some of these technologies to be able to mitigate the effects of climate change. Already we're seeing that in a lot of our crops that the season is shortening up and considerably, because through temperature increases we're seeing that plants are flowering earlier, and the products are being able to be harvested much earlier. Every year we see those dates coming back a day or two from flowering dates to harvest dates. So and that's good in some aspects, but we also need some level of cooling for a lot of our crops so that they actually do flower. And so if we lose that level of cooling, we're going to have to find ways of mitigating that. And again, it might come back to genetics, whether we can select plants that don't need so much winter chilling and cooling to enable them to flower. So again, and that we might not be able to breed fast enough to keep up with climate change. So some of these new technologies might need to be considered. But before we can do that, I think we are going to have quite a considered dialogue with many different stakeholders in New Zealand around the use of these technologies. And you're very right that in saying that it's not really just about the food that we produce for ourselves. Only a very small amount of the food that we produce is actually consumed by New Zealanders. I mean, we produce enough food in New Zealand to feed 40 million people, so most of our food actually goes offshore and is consumed by others. And it's also understanding whether those people that we feed overseas and what their thoughts are about some of these new technologies as well. And they're in a diversity of countries from China, US, Europe, all through Asia. So what are their views on these new technologies, and what do they think about them, and will they still be willing to consume foods if we use these technologies, even if we have to consider them under climate change, or even for sustainability, if we want to reduce the inputs and fertilizers on these, and gene technologies are a way to do that, will they still accept our products? So it's complicated.
Yeah, and I think there's no kind of single solution to all of the issues. One of the other I guess approaches I've seen is urban farming or vertical farming, where we have a container effectively with vertical crops growing in a hydroponic system that can be climate regulated because it's indoors, and you can control all of the inputs very easily. Do you think that we will explore some of those things in New Zealand, even though we do have a lot of land here? I know that's happening in other urban areas in other parts of the world, but do you guys do any work with urban farming in that space, or is that something that you guys are just kind of observing from afar?
the short answer is we're starting to, and the main reason we are looking at some of those vertical farming technologies is not because we think it's going to be the future necessarily for New Zealand in terms of production, because in New Zealand we've still got a fantastic climate, and we've got, I think there's a lot of advantages to using our outdoor soils and sunlight to grow fantastically good food. But we do think it's a possible way that we might be, that some of the mega cities around the world in Southeast Asia and China, and for instance, might look at producing their own food. I mean, if we think about COVID-19 and I'm sure a lot of people, a lot of countries around the world are thinking about food security now. They're realizing if there's one thing they do need to make sure is that they have guaranteed continuous supply of food. One thing that didn't stop over COVID-19 lockdowns is food production, and the requirements for food kept going. So cities are thinking about producing food, and if they don't have any land to produce it on, they are looking at these new technologies. Singapore and Shanghai, and they're all looking at these technologies. And so what happens if those cities work out how to make enough food for them, and they don't need to buy food from New Zealand anymore? So how do we still make a living in a world where our markets are working out how to make their own food? And the answer probably is for us to be part of that disruption ourselves. So is there a role for New Zealand in developing some of these technologies and then deploying New Zealand in a box, if you like, into Shanghai that has our own cultivars in it, and where New Zealand can still have a business being part of that trend as well? So yes, we are looking at that, and we think that there are opportunities for New Zealand to be part of that. That doesn't mean we're going to take the foot off the pedal in terms of developing or doing research to improve our production here in New Zealand. We think that's as equally as important, but we think it's also probably wise for us to have a sort of a buck each way.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point to kind of wrap things up, and it's really fascinating talking about all of these different opportunities, but also the challenges that we have. So I think there's going to be an interesting dialogue over the next few years and for New Zealand about all of the new opportunities that we have in this space, and how we can rebrand or rethink how we want to sell products overseas and also create amazing food here. So Richard, thanks so much for taking the time to chat this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers, everyone.
Kia ora.